because it talks about regional transportation authorities, but then goes into all these other things that it's just basically areas that need some help with public improvements. So areas that are in a decline that need help expanding or retaining employment, trying to attract major investment, or preserving or enhancing the tax base, or in which 50% or more of the structures are 35 years or more older. So these are our enterprise zones. Lots of opportunity there. So you can see it goes all the way down to the city limits at the bottom, over to 24th in some areas, and over, it's hard to tell.
Ward 7 is one.
Yeah, south of Highway 9, that's, I'm guessing, just by where the line is, that's probably right where 36th is, south of Highway 9, on the east. And then Core Norman, that the sort of funky shape there in the middle, that's not included, 12th Avenue is on the east, and the railroad tracks. That's an interesting area, but that may be Griffin property. So that's something we'd want to zoom into and look at a little bit further. But we have lots of opportunities here. Robinson, obviously, and Porter, that area, and then the UNP area is also an enterprise zone.
What is the void area in the middle of the map there? It's just south of Main
Yeah,
Street, downtown area, right? And
Yeah, originally I was going to say that was OU, but
that's what I thought.
where
It's
it
east of the
is,
tracks.
it's east of the
triangles
tracks.
are-
That's like everything.
It's like the duck pond and all that.
Lincoln Elementary and all that stuff.
Yeah, so south of Alameda.
Okay.
And I don't know why that would get pulled
That's
out.
what I was
That's
gonna
kind of
ask.
interesting.
Yeah.
It's a weird map. I'll just
Okay.
say.
That is interesting.
Yeah, it looks like that, and all of the Southridge Historic District is not.
Right, right. And the Southbridge, because it's a historic district, could qualify another way,
Yeah.
if that's the direction we
Faculty
went.
Heights
but-
is that smaller square to the right, and then the other bigger square there is where the abandoned grocery store and Kennedy and Irving are.
Yeah.
Councilman Grant, do you have a question?
Yeah, so we'll see different maps going through each of the different areas. Does it get wider a little bit? Like, I was just wondering over wherever Ed Noble is over here.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking like Lindsay side of Ed Noble, not Main Street side.
Yeah. So that could qualify, there's not a map really for these reinvestment areas, but if it could be shown that, that the structures are 35 years or older, or there's this economic stagnation, things like that, I think you could justify something over there. It's just not automatically qualified by the designation.
That actually brings up a good point. How would we go about getting a new enterprise zone established?
It's all through the Department of Commerce. A lot of it is through the federal government's opportunity zones that they
Okay.
designate. So the Department of Commerce says this, they update it every year, but they grandfather in anybody that was in an enterprise zone before.
Okay.
So this is the grandfathered map, so it's inclusive of everything. But every year they issue new maps to kind of show
Okay.
new areas of enterprise zones.
Because I feel like the Lindsay Street corridor definitely qualifies for that 35 and older.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's definitely opportunities out there
Right.
that we could use reinvestment.
Okay. Thank you.
Reinvestment TIF, yeah. So historic districts, of course, we've just got 3 residential areas, but those would potentially qualify. It's, you have to have something in the National Register of Historic Places and be subject to historic zoning. Well, of course, the Register of Historic Places is kind of where we start when we create a historic district, so you'll see they're all included, pretty much. But those are all areas, and their map is maybe the hardest to read or make sense of, but the red dots are where they have historic features identified, and then the blue dots are where they've determined there are eligible sites, or blue lines, rather. So those would be your historic places.
So just because it's a historic place doesn't mean it qualifies. It actually has to be in a historic district as well.
Right,
Okay.
right. So some things to think about in identifying sites for the master plan is, of course, does it qualify? Is it in one of those areas? Could we gather data to support it in a reinvestment area, things like that? But then what level of public improvements or assistance and development financing would be needed to improve the area? Are we talking about just like Campus Corner? It was $1 million. That wouldn't get us as far now, but that got us sidewalks, streetlights, things like that. In Campus Corner that were helpful, and we were able to pay that back fairly quickly.
Councilmember Grant.
Can I ask, because it was before my time, how did you come up with the project list? Was it a back and forth with Campus Corner property owners and merchants?
I believe so. It was before my time too. It was in 2002, or I think 2002, just a few years before me. But yeah, I think it was just Campus Corner was kind of falling apart, and so they worked with the Campus Corner ownership groups to try and develop some plan to do some things in that area in terms of public improvements. They didn't use any development financing or anything like that. It was solely public improvements. A very small TIF, paid off pretty quickly, differently than what we envisioned, but still far short of the 25 years that you could have a TIF for. There's some areas in town you can think where maybe it's just road improvements, maybe it's better lighting, things like that to kind of dress up the area that would be enough for a business to come into vacant spots. Maybe we need more than that. So those are the kind of things we need to think of. But then we also need to think of whatever we're doing, is that going to generate the increment to pay for it? So do we think if we create this TIF, are there vacant lots or are areas primed for redevelopment that would generate additional property tax and additional sales tax to help fund all of the public improvements that's envisioned? And so those are kind of the things you have to consider. I think the easy ones, Griffin, we all have been talking about that, Lindsay and 12th. I think that's an easy one where you've got some vacant space, you've got some public improvements that could be helpful. But I wanted to kind of see what other locations you want us to dig in. You've got a list, I bet, Councilmember Grant.
I as well.
But what other locations do you want us to dig into a little further that we could start including in this analysis?
I'll just say off the bat, because it's the one that's, for me, working its way through faster than the other ones. Obviously, I care about Griffin. But I was thinking Robinson and Porter. There is an affordable housing, was going to be multi-use. I don't know. We're still working with the developer. But, we're talking about what ways as a city can we incentivize the building affordable housing or below market rate. And I have done research where folks do participatory budgeting in the creation of these TIFs and figure out in their project areas what kind of projects they want. So the neighbors in this area and maybe some of the businesses might be like, yes, we do want to see affordable housing come to this corner. Also, we have Center City TIF, which is great, but it doesn't go to the east, past the east side of the tracks. And there is a great opportunity off Ponca in Maine in the 400 block where that business and group of owner, or now it's a group of owners, but they put time and effort into their location, and we own actually the sidewalk and the parking. And so they've talked about could we have some parallel parking on the Ponca side of things, alley improvements like you see on the 1 and 200 block of Maine, where there's drain grates that go down to the pipes and take it away. Because I would say Ponca side, it floods at that alley going down. And then they wanted trees, sidewalk. They were interested in a colorful crosswalk and a four-way just to create a really walkable transition, bright space from the neighborhood to the 400 block of Maine. I'm trying to stay to my area. Campus Corner was another one we talked about potentially revisiting. Also on mine were North Flood, Acres, and Robinson, like off of Flood, but between those two. Highland Parkway areas where I'm thinking.
Councilmember Schuler.
I think we were talking about where the abandoned grocery store is, Alameda and 12th on the east side.
Lindsay and 12th.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Lindsay, yeah. But there's some things on Alameda too that I would say, like even between that area, that also may qualify, I think, based on the stuff. But yeah, Lindsay and 12th, and then I mean, most of Ward 2 was not in any of that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really ripe
But
areas.
if we can think about Lindsay and 12th, I think that's a good.
And if there are other areas that aren't an enterprise zone necessarily, but maybe we could do more research and determine if it qualifies a reinvestment area, that might be worthwhile to do.
Lindsay Street was definitely on the top of my list just because it's the gateway of the university. It's kind of, we put public investment into it that it didn't pan out the way I think we had anticipated for the business owners, and, just doing something to stimulate that corridor a little bit and bring it back to life. I think it'd be a lot of value. And I really like what you're saying about, Robinson and Porter, how we reimagine the Norman Regional Porter campus, how that whole intersection gets redeveloped and reimagined. I think some stimulus there would make a lot of sense. I've thought about areas like Ed Noble Parkway, like you alluded to, the mall, the outlying parcels around the mall. I don't know if a TIF is necessarily appropriate for that, but, just there's a lot of areas in our city that are ripe for some public investment to really just kind of get the ball rolling on some private investment.
Yeah, and there's lots of options. It doesn't have to be a TIF. There might be some locations where we think maybe to bring in a grocery store, maybe a sales tax rebate's a better incentive than a TIF. It just kind of depends. So we definitely want to keep that flexibility to look at each property, but happy to do more
Absolutely.
digging.
Thank you. Councilmember Holden.
Yeah, I agree with the campus corner one too. We talked about before, trying to figure out how we can go ahead and get it folded into the Center City TIF, since I just don't foresee a parking garage being built there anytime soon. And
Yeah.
I think it's important that Campus Corner be a part of the Center City TIF and be part of the form-based code as well. And then the downtown east of the tracks, Taponka perhaps, and then definitely the North Porter up to Robinson area and how that ties into the hospital redevelopment and the Griffin property potentially, and then East 12th and Lindsay, East 12th and Alameda. Potential in the future of like South Campus around Lloyd Noble Center area. What could be done to incentivize housing development, high density, affordable housing. Lots of vacant land down there to be developed that the university may own all of it. And then whatever happens with Lloyd Noble Center in the future, it could be a way to incentivize more housing. So that's really one of the tools I'm seeing it primarily as in these different areas, being able to, could we incentivize development of housing in these parking lots? And then the Perfect Swing property, if there's a way, that could be a way to get that property stimulate that property to redevelop, I should say. And maybe, and who knows what it could be. It could be another area for high density housing that's in the current service area. And then West Lindsay, like we talked about before, where, that one strip mall that folks don't think it looks very nice, but there's not an empty storefront in it.
Right.
So maybe tearing down the strip mall is not a good idea, but could there be some incentive that could help them make it look a little nicer, or
I've seen facade grants and things like
Yeah.
that that really work out well.
Infill in that parking lot, and other areas around West Lindsay where we saw there's, some of the businesses here and they have parking in front, but then behind them there's nothing, or there's another big giant parking lot
Right.
that nobody ever uses. So that's another opportunity for housing development potentially, and without expanding outwardly more.
Right.
And then Ed Noble Parkway, again, to help encourage more housing development in their area. I think one of the best things that could help Ed Noble Parkway is to have more people living around it, right?
I agree.
And, there is a neighborhood to the west of it, but nobody that lives in that neighborhood is walking to Ed Noble Parkway. And so having people that live directly in it, and maybe incentivizing some sort of development of a public amenity there. You know, there's that kind of pond back there that I think was supposed to be something, but never ended up being anything but just like a ditch and stuff going on back there. So some sort of public amenity that would make people want to go hang out in that area.
Right.
And then North Flood area from Acres to Robinson, that area I think fits the most like appropriate area that struggles a little bit, has a lot of businesses on it, but the streets all busted up, the sidewalks are not continuous, they're busted up, there's no lighting really. And then airport area, it could be
Oh, yeah.
another potential use of that as well.
Yeah.
For housing or commercial development or aviation related type stuff or aerospace, job type
great.
creation. So those are some of the ones I had written down around Norman.
And I know
where that
Oklahoma-
could be a thing.
I know Oklahoma City just approved a TIF, not just, they actually just finished building the building, but it was a TIF for I want to say 400 unit apartment complex in downtown Norman, and I think 50% of the units were affordable, under market rate. And that's the only thing the TIF went to fund were those below market rate units. That did nothing with the construction, nothing else. And so like the stipulations of the TIF were you've got to pass those savings on to the consumer for 25 years. And so I think that's absolutely something appropriate. I'd be all about that. So Councilmember Grant.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, what I heard also Councilmember Holman say, so I've seen a small business improvement fund in some TIFs, a neighborhood improvement fund for those who, might be, under threat of gentrification. And then I've seen 30% of a TIF put towards the creation of affordable housing. But yeah, for the small business improvement one, it was like they could do facades, like you were talking about that grant. But it's kind of one of those things too. It's like I would like to see participatory budgeting style engagement. It's like, go to Highland Parkway area and it's like, hey, you guys what do you need? And then also the residents in that area too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that was kind of my motivation with getting this topic out here is like really the idea of a master plan. Like, okay, so we've identified all these different TIF districts. Like what does this one need? When's the appropriate time to trigger it? And, more so, when is the appropriate time to trigger it so that it can play off other TIF districts? So we talk about the companion to Center City. Well, that's right next to a Griffin TIF. And so do you trigger both of those at the same time? Or do you trigger the downtown one first and let that generate investment in Griffin so that you wait to start that 25-year clock until you've got the big project coming online? Just, really so we can game plan and time out all of these things, much like Oklahoma City has done, where excuse me if I get the terminology mixed up, but the project the collection area is specific to a little area, but the project area is the entire city.
Right, so they have one TIF district for the downtown area.
Right.
But then they have multiple increment districts under that, and that's what triggers the 25-year timeline.
Right.
And so as something gets ready to start, they can trigger that under that existing project, that plan.
Exactly.
They just do an amendment and create a new increment district.
That's what I was trying to say. You said it a lot better than I did. Councilmember
Yeah, my
Schuler.
question was around like logistics of that, like creating that and then helping, or like figuring out like what our boundaries are going to be, and then so we could decide that without someone coming to us and saying like, I would like a TIF for the X project. Like we can create some of those on the front end, and that way people can kind of know this is what we're thinking about. These are the types of incentives that could be available. These are the types of things that we want to do within the district.
Yeah, so typically a project area would be defined with a TIF plan to start with. So we would start with maybe the first one we do and maybe draw the project area larger, and then we set it up for future increment districts to be created under that guiding.
So the statutory TIF review committee that we have, they would be, once we have a plan for like triggering any of these future TIF districts, they would be reviewing.
Yeah, I think the way Oklahoma City does them is they create new increment districts, they still go through a very similar process because even if you're not creating a brand new project plan, it's definitely a substantial change. And so you have to go through the same process by statute.
Okay, so it might be something that we would then have, if we plan to do this, then we would have a more standing committee.
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
Yeah, does Oklahoma City have one broader TIF committee and then specialized ones for each district?
As far as statutory TIF committee
Yeah.
goes, I think it would just be the one, because they're set up by statute. You have to have someone from the assessor's
Okay.
office, someone from each
Gotcha, okay.
taxing jurisdiction, not assessor's office, but taxing jurisdiction, and then maybe they choose different at-large members for each one. I don't know, I'd have to look into
Okay,
that.
I was curious. Councilmember Grant.
I had a question for Anthony, and I sent an email, and maybe you saw it, or maybe you didn't. But I was kind of curious about the effects of having multiple TIF districts on the general fund, if that was a concern to think about in the future.
Again, it's always a question of cost-benefit analysis, you know, how much benefit does the general fund get from this development that you want to subsidize through a TIF district? And if you decide that it's worth that, then yes, there would be some cost to the general fund in the apportionment of taxes away from the general fund. And when I say general fund here, understand that I may not be talking about the city's general fund, but rather the counties or the school districts. Okay, so those are the considerations that each jurisdiction has to make. But yes, you always have to consider the overall benefit versus the overall cost. It's an individual calculation for each one that you might propose, but you would assume that if you've approved this TIF district, you have assumed that the benefit outweighs the cost.
Especially like something like housing, if you're subsidizing the housing, you're getting people to live in the area. They're gonna spend their tax dollars, maybe not in the TIF district, but they now live in Norman. They're gonna order things online, that you'll collect sales tax off online purchase to that house. So we might see less. Yes.
I was just thinking in the phasing of these things and also the percentages collected, because it's not like you would take 100%
Right.
of the sales tax from a district. You could say 30% or less or 70. You know, it's really dependent on, I guess, the projects that are wanted. So, yeah, that was just my question about the
Short
planning
answer
it
is
out.
Yeah.
individual consideration.
Makes sense. Councilmember Nash.
So, now I know sales tax and property tax, what other varieties of, just for my own information, of TIFs are there?
Sales tax and property taxes are the only funding sources for TIFs.
Okay. And,
You can do other mechanisms that
Right.
would, you know, you could do a room tax, for example, but that's not a TIF.
Right.
You would just
Okay.
do some sort of a rebate agreement with a hotel, for example.
all right, now any of these projects are gonna be pretty speculative, and anything that's directly affecting sales tax, it will have a significant, well, it will have some non-zero impact on the general fund, correct?
Yes.
And are there any protections in place, like an upper cap or anything on TIFs that the council has to pass?
No.
No.
No, I mean, I think with each TIF, you just want to make sure that as you create them, you're looking at project costs that you can reasonably expect increment to be generated to fund. And so probably a lot of these are going to be smaller. You'll have some that would be really big, like if we ever had Griffin come off the ground, that would be a really big TIF. But maybe Lindsay and 12th or Alameda and 12th are smaller, 2 million, 3 million, something like that. But every one of them you'll have to look at individually and decide, can we set the project cost at an amount that we can recover? So it's really going to depend on which project you're choosing.
Okay. So I think it would possibly be a reasonable expectation that there be some sort of limit. I mean, maybe more than $1, but less than $1 billion on sales tax that that gets reapportioned from these TIFs. And while I do agree that every council after us will be perfectly benevolent, there's absolutely none of them that would make any kind of irrational or unsound decisions. Yeah, what other, like, have any other municipalities ever put any kind of ordinances into place that require the people to have some kind of official say in TIFs exceeding a certain threshold?
Not that I'm aware of. I think I would probably have heard of one in Oklahoma if there was one. Missouri, they use tax increment financing quite a bit. I don't know of any ordinances there, but I haven't looked specifically for that outside of Oklahoma.
Okay. So, now, most of you have seen this in an earlier version. I've got a couple of revisions in there, though. There's an ordinance requiring voter approval for the establishment of tax increment financing zones affecting sales tax, specifically and solely sales tax within the city limits, and intended for the reallocation of sales tax totaling greater than or equal. And right now, I've just got 100 million. That's one of those variables that can be discussed, but anything that's, say in this case, greater than or equal to $100 million, because this is money that's directly affecting, goes into municipal services. And I think there is a certain point where the people should have more of a say than just to bestow that kind of power with the city and council. And in terms of incorporating this into any kind of master plan, is that would that be? Well, I guess this is a list of projects, but then kind of parallel to that, is there any way that we can explore this topic of putting some kind of limit in place? Perhaps you probably
Thank you.
want to see
Good
one
to
too.
see, yeah.
Sorry about that.
I mean, that's really up to council. If that's something council wants to explore, we can definitely do that. And I think that doesn't probably change the master plan at this point. It would definitely change maybe some of the projects you could do without a vote and change some of the planning and those kind of things. So as that develops, I think it would be informed by an ordinance like this if it were adopted.
So,
Could I
Council,
ask if you could refresh my memory on what the Charter Review Committee considered related to
Yeah,
this?
thank you. The Charter Review Committee, when it most recently met, considered the question of whether or not any TIF over $5 million should be approved by the voters. I staffed that committee along with Brenda Hall, and they struggled with that question quite a bit. Same kind of thing you're saying is at some point, maybe you should get voter input. But they did not want to hamstring future councils, and so they were really uncomfortable with setting a dollar amount. They did not discuss anything close to 100 million from what I recall. They were
Five's
they were
kind
at the
of
lower end.
Five's pretty low, and I think that would have significant impacts on any kind of projects that we look at. I mean, how of these projects that we've listed here, how many of those it wouldn't be at least kind of near that number?
Yeah, maybe Lindsay in 12th, the lower number. That is a challenge. And one of the things they were worried about too is if you set an amount in the charter, what $5 million bought you 25 years
Right.
ago versus what it gets you in 25 years are two very different things. And so those were kind of the things, I can send you all the minutes of that discussion, but those are kind of the things they struggled with. But again, the original question was 5 million. They explored other amounts. And
kind
just
of-
opted not to put it on the ballot.
The cleanest way, of course, would be some kind of percentage of, say, the general fund of the year prior, or the average of so many years prior, but then incorporating math into our ordinances has its own issues. On these projects that we're kind of looking at here, what would you say the upper end of?
I think Griffin could be, I mean, I'm just throwing out numbers. It depends on what project costs were determined, but just the purchase price alone for Griffin was the state was wanting over $50 million. That didn't include asbestos removal. That didn't include clearing the buildings. So that is probably a larger amount. Lindsay and 12th may not be. It depends on what public improvements you guys wanted to have there. If it's just easy sort of campus corner TIF type improvements, or if it was road construction, things like that, obviously the price is going to go up. So it really just depends on what the project costs are. for each area.
All right. Are there any thoughts on this proposal?
Is it on this?
Yeah, I was kind of curious. So there's a difference between it like being in the charter and an ordinance, right?
Right. I mean, a charter would require a vote of the people to change versus an ordinance requiring just a vote of the council.
So a future council could say 100 million is too low in today's money in the future. We want to raise, that would be easier to,
Amend.
yeah.
Yeah,
And-
definitely.
Okay. So benefits to an ordinance if you were considering it.
Yeah, I think charter would be that may be a little too set in stone for having the ability to modify this based on whatever comes up in the future would be kind of a critical thing to at least continue to have at our power or at our disposal. But anyone think that 100 million is too low?
I think my heartburn, favorite word, just comes from, that set dollar amount of like, $100 million is a lot of money today, but yeah, in 25 years, is it still a lot of money? I don't know. I just don't know how you land on a dollar amount. I think that's where my frustration really comes from. I think it's a good idea. I understand the logic, and I think you've got sound reasoning. I just don't know what dollar amount to pull out of thin air. To like, where do you land? 100 million seems reasonable, but
Yeah. And we can't let perfection be the enemy of good here.
exactly.
I mean,
That's kind of why I was kind of asking on these projects, get an idea of like ballpark in today's projects and today's vision view.
Before we go too much further down the road, are we running afoul of the agenda by talking about this?
No, I don't want to get too far into the ordinance
Okay.
because that wasn't agendized, but I do appreciate you bringing
Yeah.
it to us and.
I only say that is like, I'm willing to have this conversation at another
Yeah.
time. Like, I'm not trying to end it. I just don't want to.
All right, still parallel but a little too far of a distance from that master plan. Gotcha.
So we'll reconvene and get that as an actual agendized topic, because I think it's worth having a discussion on. Absolutely.
Okay, so if you guys want to move on, Anthony, you're the next contestant in the docket. Anthony's going to talk about public and private financing with Sam Noble Museum, just to give you guys an example of another sort of creative solution to a problem. He lived this, I did not, but I did make a slide for
I
him.
inherited this. And I will say, this came about because as we were discussing the University North Park Entertainment District proposal, and there were these kind of contingent discussions about the Weather Museum, and I'm going to be calling it the Weather Museum. There was quite a bit of interest from the individual council members about the Weather Museum, and that it might be politically very popular. And so one of the things that I discussed at that time with the mayor was that this was very similar to how the Sam Noble Museum was financed. And so what I did here was just give you some background on that financing for the Sam Noble Museum. Talk about the fact that it was actually an initiative petition that came forward after the museum had been made the State Museum of Natural History. There was a group of citizens who petitioned and presented that petition to the council. 2,771 signatures, and the council put it on the ballot in November of 1991. It passed with about a 2/3 vote. The bonds were issued in 1994 for about $5 million of seed money toward the construction of the Sam Noble Museum. And it's important to understand that the sort of general obligation bonds that we're talking about here are what are called economic development or industrial development bonds. And there's a specific section of the Oklahoma Constitution that enables municipalities to issue industrial or economic development bonds with a simple majority vote. So that is what was proposed in 1991, and that is what passed. It's called a limited tax general obligation bond because this section of the Constitution limits the millage rate to 5 mills, and that is a cumulative limit of 5 mills. So as you issue more bonds are paid off, that sort of thing, you can only have 5 mills of outstanding industrial development bonds. So in Norman's case, that's about $55 million cumulatively that we could issue under this section of the Constitution. Some of you may recall that we most recently proposed to do some of these sections of general obligation bonds with the stormwater proposal that was defeated some years ago, but that would have been under this section of the bonds. And then, again, the interesting thing about this is that there's only 2 sections of the Constitution that enables simple majority general obligation bonds to be voted on and approved by the voters. One is for public utilities, and there's been a series of court cases over the years that defines what a public utility is. But clearly, a museum that is not owned by the city does not qualify as a public utility. But this would qualify. A museum could qualify as an economic development bond. And what the Mr. Forsyth and the folks that at the existing Weather Museum have talked about is about $10 or $15 million worth of seed money toward their proposed $110 million museum. Very similar to the Sam Noble Museum and the Stovall Museum, having had the artifacts on hand, they just needed a building. Very similar here. Catherine and I toured the existing Weather Museum a couple of weeks ago, and again, they have a lot of stuff. They just need a better place to put it in and exponentially increase the offerings of what they have for the science in the interested public. So that's what we're talking about here. I won't go into any more detail than what you have in the cover memo here, but the actual ordinance that was approved by the council and voted on by the people in 1991 is attached along with the constitutional section that we're talking about, and then some information on what the voters saw and what was actually approved and pitched to the public that was ultimately approved. So again, just for your discussion, I think it's an interesting proposal. I will say that, this is just background information. I don't know for a fact that the Team Norman folks or the OU Foundation, or for that matter, the Weather Museum officials want to do this, want to propose it to the public. But just understand that it is an alternative way of getting that seed money in place if you think that the voters would approve it. And it would identify, unlike a TIF, it would identify a new source of revenue to pay for it. And so from a financial perspective, that's the inviting thing about the proposal.
2 quick questions. Does it have to be location specific? Do we have to have a site picked out?
That would be what you would put into the ordinance.
Okay.
But yes, the proposal, and this is toward the back of the attachments that you have, the area that they're talking about is in the University North Park area. They want to be just right up against the runway of the airport, because a lot of what they want to do relates to weather and aviation.
Gotcha, that makes sense. And then you said we're only able to legally bond up to 5 mills. Is that what I heard? Do we currently have any of that?
We have
eaten
none
up?
outstanding right now.
Okay, excellent. Councilmember Schuler.
Yeah, I think that this is really attractive when we're talking about all of the different, like the TIF master plan, and thinking about protecting what future projects are going to be in Norman Forward too, and this opportunity to do something like this and this way shields us from having to add this to the Norman Forward 2 and the waiting, and this could be done faster, because I know that they're on a kind of different timeline with the Weather Museum, and I've heard in discussions when we were talking about the entertainment district and what's going to happen in the north part of UNP, that something like this is what the community is excited about and looking forward to. And so I think that going forward and kind of proposing it this way would actually be received well by the community, and it's not wrapped up in all of the other conversations about all of the things that they don't like on how we do public financing. So I'm kind of excited about this route.
I mean, to that point, this is the kind of project that could buoy up a slate of other projects. But at the same time, it's such a good project that I don't want I don't want to risk it getting dragged down by another slate of projects, if that makes sense. Exactly what you're saying, like.
Yeah,
It's so good it can stand on its own.
And we have so many projects potentially identified for like what Norman Forward 2 could be, that like this doesn't necessarily need to be in that slate. Like we can get more projects
I agree.
too. And I wondered then too, like, are there other things that would qualify for something like this, especially if we don't have any?
Industrial development bonds it's very broad,
Yeah.
what you can do.
I mean,
It's just
55
limited to 5 million.
55 million is
That's a pretty high
real money.
ceiling. Like that's real. It's a real amount, and you're saying 10 to 15 million for this for seed money.
And do we have any risk exposure to going up to the 55 million, other than just having to satisfy the debt, just being able to pay debt for service on
Yeah,
it?
and remember that the voters approve a levy of property tax to pay the debt.
Okay.
So that's the beauty of it for me.
It's strictly property
Is
tax.
general obligation bonds in general.
Okay.
Is that there is a new source of revenue to repay the debt.
I like that. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Councilmember Grant?
I second what's been said because I was just thinking about what the future Andrews Park master plan that we saw looked pretty expensive. My other thought was, you said in one of our finance meetings that was like a bull market for bonds. What is that? And then also, do you have to think about this over the, like, is there ever going to be a time
Now, remember,
where
the market, when I say bull market, that's a two-headed coin.
Yeah.
What I was talking about there was that interest rates being relatively high as relative to where they've been the last 4 or 5 years means that we're making better investment returns. It also means, however, that the interest rates on a bond would probably be relative to where they were 3 or 4 years ago higher. But again, the voters would approve a levy to repay the debt wherever it is. We will always try to get the lowest interest rates possible, but the market drives, the market determines.
So it's not like you pass it and it's fixed, it will fluctuate. Okay, just wanted clarity on that, thank you.
Councilmember Rowland?
Yeah, I agree with the comments. If the council back in 1991, they could have decided to do that on their own. They didn't need signatures. That just happened to be how it came about.
It's initiative petition versus referendum, so the council can always pass an ordinance to put something on the ballot.
Okay. Well, I think that would be if they're interested and if we hear, I guess, more feedback, if that's a direction people might want to go, then it sounds pretty good to have a vote of the people on it and be able to provide the seed money. They'd still have to fundraise and do all that to do the whole project, but a way for us to get something that we may all want, that may be able to spur other economic activity.
Yeah, exactly.
And provide a real destination for where it's located,
Right.
If it's located in that area, if other stuff is approved and built around there, that would be like an anchor draw to me. Like people would go there just for that, I could see potentially, but, so yeah, I think that's a good idea to put that out there and see if that's a direction
No, I agree. And,
you might want to go.
given our proximity to just weather in general and then the National Weather Center, I could see voters really wrestling with the thing. Like, this cannot be built anywhere but Norman. Like, it's got to be built here in Norman. And so I think there'd be a real emotional push to get something like this approved. So, Councilmember Schuler.
Yeah, kind of along the same lines of that. And I think when we were having initial conversations with, the people who were kind of studying, like, was the feasibility study of doing this and the new building and the experience. And I remember talking about, where are other levels? It's not just the city, but like there's going to be, a corporate push and fundraising, and then having talks with the state level too, and with the, tourism department as kind of a whole. And I think that those things were going well. And I think everybody really recognizes that Norman is the place, like we are the place for this. And I think showing quickly that we want to be a part of this and that we are supportive of doing this kind of pushes everybody else to say, like, the location stays here. Like, you're not leaving us.
Right. We're
Please
committed.
don't go anywhere else, right? We're committing our support, and I think a public vote also shows the foundational support for that. and yeah, I anybody that I've talked to that I've heard anything about this is excited, and not just that like it's a museum, but that they're really looking at like the experience and having some kind of like ride or something kind of like akin to like the Twister ride and at Universal and some things like that, so like people can really experience. I guess the awe of
Right.
weather
Yeah.
and those things. And so it's really like, I would also say in some ways like a science museum too, right? Hands-on,
Hands-on,
learning. So yeah, not just boring, walk in, like read all the things, but like doing something. And I would say Sam Noble is like that too. Like there's a lot of things for like kids and the activities and all of those types of things.
Oh, yeah.
So, and the location, next to WIFAC and all of the hotels, right? Like this is like, oh, what am I going to do with my other kid while, one of my kids is in a basketball tournament. Like maybe the other parent takes them over to the weather museum. And,
Right. You
so
start to get a
things like
critical
that.
mass of things in one location. No, I agree. I think
That's what people want for an entertainment district, in my opinion.
I completely agree with that. I mean, that unique draws to Norman.
Yeah.
Something that nobody else has, not just in the state, but literally
In
in
the
the country
world.
or the world. Yeah, I mean, like that you come to Norman, Oklahoma to do this, and it's the only place you can do it. That's why everybody travels to Florida or California to go to Disney World. I mean, it's just like there's anyway.
We're all very excited about this.
I'm very excited. I mean, I think this is an amazing project. It's an incredible opportunity. Do what I can, do what we can to make it happen. So, what do you need from us to further direction?
I've heard consensus
Okay.
that, you want to proceed, and we'll talk to the city manager about timing and that sort of thing. But again, what would come before council would be this ordinance to put it on the ballot, and you talk about when and that sort of thing.
Okay. Any idea on when?
The very last thing in the memo is talking about the available dates
Okay.
in 2024.
I know we're limited.
So, yeah, it's a very limited number of dates, but there's a June, August, and November date.
August, when kids are going back to school.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to put it on a presidential ballot. I mean, I say I'm confident that it would get, it would pass regardless of the turnout, I think. And so maybe a larger number.
More turnout is always good.
Yeah. Well, I just mean on something like this, but giving as many people the opportunity to have buy-in on this idea, have ownership.
Well,
would
I
be a
will
better
say
word.
that the June 25th date is statewide
Yeah.
election, so like
Yeah,
primary
primary,
election
yeah.
stuff. So like that'll be a big election date. August is their runoff
Right.
date. So, and then obviously state stuff is also on the federal ballot in November. So like, I don't think that any of those are bad potential dates because they're paired with other things that people should, will be
Right.
paying attention to get out. It's not like our lowly city council elections.
So I guess a conversation with the existing weather museum to kind of see what their timeline looks like, and if there's a date that's more advantageous for them, let's circle around that. So, okay. Is there any other thoughts or questions on this topic? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, guys.